Hi, I'm Marta Steele. I'm here to talk about my book, Grassroots, Geeks, Pros, and Pals, the Election Integrity Movement's Rise and Non-Stop Battle to Win Back the People's Vote, 2000 through 2008. Here it is. It has a regular text, obviously. It's copiously endnoted, but the endnotes are on a CD, so the book wouldn't be too fat. It has three appendixes, one explaining the different sorts of voting machines that I discuss in the text so that you can understand what I'm talking about. The third appendix talks about how I got into the election integrity movement, and the second appendix attempts to set the scene for 2008, what was going on in the outside world. So before I get into my discussion of the actual book, I want to contextualize it and get across my main points. Our vote is the single most important right granted to us by our democracy. Without it, democracy is dead. Election corruption is a time-honored habit in this country, you may say, but the number of people disenfranchised escalated exponentially following the proliferation of electronic systems into the election process after 2000. The huge panic generated by the hanging chads debacle, election 2000 was plagued by far more than hanging chads, made things far worse, threatening to dismantle our democracy altogether. Grassroots, Geeks, Pros, and Pals documents the worst decade in the history of voting in this country and the gradual and then critical rise of the grassroots movement that fought back and won the people's right to choose their president. We're still fighting at other levels of government, and the battle for fair voting still rages. Fully 10 million people were kept from voting in 2012, and it's no coincidence that Barack Obama would have been their choice had they been permitted to exercise their constitutional rights. The election integrity movement is nonetheless bipartisan and fights with equal energy wherever election corruption is found. Now, what set off this worst decade in the history of election integrity? It was panic resulting from a hideous fiasco in Florida during election 2000. First of all, the governor of Florida was brother of the Republican candidate for presidency, George W. Bush. His Secretary of State, the person in charge of elections, was also co-chair of the Republican presidential campaign. Now, what she did that I think was one of the worst disasters of this election scene in Florida was to outsource 67 county voting lists to a data cruncher, Database Technologies, which turned into ChoicePoint, outsourced it to them and instructed them to find names throughout the country of felons that matched people on the county voter lists, and on that basis to delete them as felons. As a result, 94,000 people were deleted from the Florida voting lists statewide. Among them, 54% were black. Now, these lists were revealed to the public by Greg Palast, who decrypted them from the database of the Secretary of State. And it's a horror. What ended up happening was that the Supreme Court selected the winner of Florida, which was a crucial state with its 25 electoral votes. It was decisive in this very close election, and Gore won it. 9 out of 10 studies done post-election 2000 proved that Gore would have won had a statewide recount instead of just a four-county recount been permitted, but the Supreme Court stopped the recount at a point when Bush was 537 votes ahead. Justice Scalia saying that if the recount proceeded, it would do irreparable harm to George W. Bush. And there were two other members of the Supreme Court who should have recused themselves for clear Republican connections, including Sandra Day O'Connor and Clarence Thomas. Now, in addition to this, I want to fill in the middle now that I've sketched the sides of it. The notorious hanging chads occurred, eliminating thousands of votes because punch cards were not counted. They had been punched, but not all the way through. The hanging chad is a piece of paper that doesn't quite get dislodged from the ballot. Also, there were bumps that made clear the voter intent, but the machine didn't count them because they were just bumps, convex or concave. There were butterfly ballots, badly designed ballots given out in a county filled with senior citizens, most of whom were liberal and Jewish, and on one side of the page were the candidates' names. On the other side, there were two facing pages. On the other side were the boxes to check, but that was improperly calibrated, so these senior citizens frequently ended up voting for Patrick Buchanan, who hardly represented their point of view. Now, let's see if there's anything. Oh, the racism was rampant, not only besides the computerized voting machines malfunctioning. The worst case scenario was one in which Gore was registered as having gained minus 16,022 votes. That was later corrected, but not before Gore had conceded the election. Then when it was corrected, Gore unconceded. But racism, let me talk about this very briefly. There are roadblocks placed in black neighborhoods. Wrong information was distributed on flyers and by a robocall that Election Day had been moved to Wednesday for Democrats. Voters were threatened to stay away if they had accrued parking ticket fines or hadn't paid child support. Otherwise they'd be arrested. And eliminating a lot more voters. Total number of voters, according to statistician Richard Charnon, was 185,000 uncounted votes altogether, not counting 94,000 who were taken off the registration list. I mean, this was a disgrace. Then in my chapter, in addition to the studies and recounts done, I have also other reactions to election 2000 in Florida also. And these included one study that found that the most efficient form of voting was hand-counted paper ballots. Another study found that the best elections were to be conducted by the people, not vendors who were a continuous presence along with these computerized machines that were so hackable. I'll discuss that later. But just the people, we the people, everywhere but the actual act of voting, we the people, registering and supervising, making sure everything is nonpartisan and objective, post voting, tabulation with paper ballots, strict supervision of transmission of paper ballots to central headquarters. So that's chapter 2, basically, and the birth of the grassroots movement on the steps of the Supreme Court the day the infamous decision was made, 5-4, to put Bush in the White House. And two groups, Democrats.com and VoterMarch.org, stood on the steps of the Supreme Court that day, rallying and making speeches. Thus was the EI, Election Integrity Movement, born. My next chapter talks about early heroes of the EI movement, and then the Help America Vote Act, which probably sounds very familiar to many of you. First heroine I'd like to discuss is Bev Harris, called the Erin Brockovich of the movement. She was surfing the web one day when she discovered a large web page from the second largest election system vendor in the country, Diebold, who also manufactured ATMs and safes and had a good name in those areas, and turned out to become ignominious in the area of election systems. The biggest of the three corporations was called Electronic Systems and Software, ES&S, and the principals of these two companies were brothers, the Yarosevich brothers, for a while, until various transformations happened, as this happens in the corporate setting. Sequoia was the name of the third of the big three. Then there were Hart InterCivic, Danaher, and other brands. So Bev found this web page that revealed huge security holes, evidence of viruses that results in changes in votes according to the will of the person inserting the virus. There were internal memos, all sorts of things. So Bev transmitted this file that took 40 hours to download to a computer expert at Johns Hopkins, Professor Aviel Rubin, who corroborated her results, found a lot more, including the fact that you could corrupt machinery from a distance, driving by with a remote, and even a magnet, because these were computers, could alter machine results. I mean, these were, as they say, lemons, and they're still in use by approximately 25% of the country. I'm talking about touchscreens anyway, DREs. But so this was such a scandal that it hit the mainstream media, which basically lost interest in the election situation after Bush was put in the White House. But this attracted nationwide attention. Now, meanwhile, the Florida fiasco had triggered panic in 3 states. Maryland and Georgia bought wall-to-wall Diebold touchscreens, the worst variety of computer voting machines, and Florida bought some of them, didn't fill all the counties with them. People were panicking. It was enough of a chaos that the federal government finally passed a bipartisan bill. Many bills had been submitted, none had been passed. The bipartisan bill passed in 2002, October 2002, was called the Help America Vote Act, HAVA for short. It was sponsored by Representative Bob Ney from Ohio and Representative Steny Hoyer from Maryland, who was responsible for authoring Title III of the Act, which concerned accessibility at the polls for all categories of people involved, including people uneasy for whom English was a second language. So HAVA, the premise of HAVA was that these punch card machines had to be ditched. Along with them, the lever machines, the 700-pound behemoths we used to vote on, which some people still champion, and they're actually going to be using in New York, I believe in October or November of this year. But then in Title III seems to contradict this and assume that we could use the machinery in question. So there are many interpretations of this bill. It was thrown together hastily, and it triggered a stampede toward electronic voting, mainly the touchscreen machines, which were the most expensive, up to $8,000 a piece, because Representative Ney, among others, and it turns out Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist, the United Lobbyist, were found to have profited greatly from the public stampeding, galloping toward these DREs. So Ney and Abramoff were subsequently imprisoned. The three large vendors donated very generously to Republican causes, including campaigns. And so there was a stampede. The optical scanners, which involved paper as well as electronics, was a far better option. A paper trail is needed for recount and auditing, that is, recounting a percentage of votes that's statistically viable. So the optical scanners cost a lot less, lasted a lot longer. The DREs lasted only 5 years. The optical scanners could last as long as 20 years. People could fill a room filling out these paper ballots, and it takes 1 second for each one of them to feed it into the scanner, as opposed to the touch screens, which were easy to use as long as they were working, and a lot of times they didn't work. You just touch the screen, it's fun, and then you click if you're on the ball, which some people weren't. You click finish when you're satisfied with that you've touched the right candidates that you want. And at the end of the day, the machine will produce a thermal paper with totals and a record of each vote. But if you ask it for a recount, it'll produce the same thermal paper strip. And if you ask it for an audit, it will produce the same strip, which really proves nothing. And HAVA required paper ballots and audits. And the people the government doled out $3.8 billion to the country for this machinery. Anyway, so these three vendors stood to gain so much. It was sleazy. It was sleazy. And they could have done a lot better. A HAVA would have helped, but this HAVA just created a mess. There's more about it in the book. I don't have time to discuss it any further. Now I discuss election 2002, in which further corruption always leans toward Republican candidates winning rather than Democrats, even popular Democrats, losing. I don't have time to discuss that further. A 2002 primary in Florida exasperated the panic because the whole election went so badly, but especially the touchscreen machinery crashing or not booting up. Now, election 2004 is the next landmark in my book, and it reiterated Florida in so many ways. The Secretary of State was also head of the Bush re-election Republican committee. His name was Kenneth Blackwell. He had worked in Florida as a computer expert for the first Bush campaign. And he did things like drawing on an antiquated law, require people to fill out only registrations on 80-pound paper, which is the equivalent of postcard stock. Another thing he did was something called caging, which involves sending out letters marked "Do Not Forward" to check and see if somebody lives at the address, while knowing that the person isn't there, and the person might be fighting in Afghanistan or in Iraq. If the letter came back unopened, the voter was stricken from the poll list, period. There was huge discrimination against the poor. It was worse than Florida. Every trick imaginable was played. The day before Election Day, Mr. Blackwell changed around a whole bunch of precincts without listing them on his webpage, so that on Election Day, when it was raining, cats and dogs, the people were lost. They didn't know which precinct they were supposed to go to. As a result of this and a lot of other mix-ups, there were long lines that stretched out outdoors in the rain. You'd see a sea of umbrellas. The poor people got the worst voting equipment and too little of it. In the primaries, they'd had access to more voting machines than during the election, and the good voting machinery went to the wealthier areas where their average weight was a lot less. The poor people stood in line for 7 hours and longer. And just about the worst thing in Ohio was something that came to be called Cybergate. And what happened was, at about 11 o'clock in Ohio, all the servers went down that were counting the votes. And as a result, for an hour and a half, there was nothing. Kerry had been 300,000 votes ahead. When the servers came up an hour and a half later, Kerry was 200,000 votes, or 100,000 votes behind. Now, nobody knew how this happened, but my publishers, Bob Petrakis and Harvey Wasserman, and the attorney from Cliff Arnebeck from Common Cause were onto it, wondering what happened. Bush ended up taking the state by 120,000 votes, but considering what happened with the servers going down, it's hard to account for these votes, especially with all the other boondoggles, the train wrecks that happened at the polls. So, according to Mark Crispin Miller, the worst situation in election 2004 actually was overseas, the expatriate vote, which trended liberal. Now, they got their registrations, they downloaded them from the internet, filled them out, mailed them to the U.S., received the ballot back, mailed the ballot to the U.S. Now, this was a lengthy process. The servers went down in September, greatly delaying the process, guaranteeing that votes of 7 million people, among the 7 million expatriates, a lot of votes could not be counted. They arrived too late. So, hold on to the Cybergate. Reactions to election 2004 immediately. Congressman John Conyers, ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, investigated. He held hearings. He researched. He had meetings. The upshot was a report called What Happened in Ohio. It came out one day before the Electoral College was to meet and select the president. Inevitably, influenced the an event that hadn't happened for more than 100 years in history. And this was a debate mandated before challenging the Ohio delegation before the vote was taken. And there's more about that in my book. The other thing to mention in this chapter is the Carter-Baker report, which recommended paper ballots, but also recommended voter ID, even though voter ID, the use of voter ID, the requirement of it, was premised on the possibility of impersonation at the polls. And this had happened, according to many studies, maybe 10 times in the last 10 years. Not worth requiring a government-issued photo ID with an expiration date on it from the entire voting population. But this spread like bacteria, like cancer, throughout the country. Initially, a utility bill would suffice, but very quickly the requirement got more stringent, and the voter IDs were hard to get a hold of if you had no proof of who you were, like a birth certificate or a passport or a driver's license. And poor people are a lot less likely than middle class or rich people to have this documentation. And to obtain these, the locations were often very inconvenient, and the hours were such that these people would be working, and the expense for ordering a replica of your birth certificate was sometimes out of their budget range. And so it did discriminate against poor people, and many states are now using voter IDs requiring it. Will be probably required in Pennsylvania next year, a swing state with a lot of electoral votes, very pivotal to election results, presidential election results. So that's Carter-Baker. Throughout my chapters, you'll find anecdotes about whistleblowers and machine malfunctions by human error or intentional hacking, proof of how quickly machines can be hacked into by 8th graders with minimal education in computer programming. Could just insert a virus card and bingo, the results that the given person wanted would appear as the totals. Now, I proceed with the next big point. There's a lot of other material. The firing of the 10 attorneys in 2007, you remember that. 10 Republican prosecutors were fired by the Department of Justice for not coming up with evidence for voter fraud, i.e. impersonation at the polls. And they refused to fake it, which they were sort of encouraged to do. And they couldn't find any. They looked for it. This was corroborated by research. It just wasn't around. They were fired, and people were leaving. Attorneys were leaving the Department of Justice for the last few years anyway. But because this was such a scandal, 10 federal prosecutors fired. Antonio Gonzalez, the Attorney General, stepped down along with many of his colleagues. And this was covered in the newspapers. I don't know about the motivation for it, but the event itself was covered. Next big thing in the book is election 2008. Primaries were fraught with problems, but the main issue was that the election protection, election integrity grassroots had mobilized in huge amounts all over the country. And it had to get the people to the polls, to help them get their voter IDs, to drive them to the polls, to educate them. And the Geeks, Pros, and Pals were all helping the election integrity oriented ones. The Democrats had taken Congress in 2006, which was a good omen. And what else happened? In September of 2008, Misters Fitrakis and Wasserman and attorney Arnebeck came upon a security expert named Stephen Spudamore, who happened to be a Bush Republican but also happened to be very concerned with election integrity, and he mapped out to them in a detailed flow chart, exactly what happened. Excuse me. And this flow chart was part of a brief, an exquisite brief, handed in by Fitrakis and Wasserman, which disputed the results in Ohio 2004, including the massive discrimination against the poor. Now what happened was, with this chart, and the source of the chart had been contracted by Blackwell, the corrupt Secretary of State, who happened to be Karl Rove's IT guru, and his name was Mike Connell. He had created this man-in-the-middle structure which siphoned the votes going out of the Secretary of State's office down to Republican servers in Chattanooga, Tennessee, through the server Connell had designed, and a man-in-the-middle structure that redistributed the votes the way they wanted them to go. Arnebeck and Fitrakis and Wasserman subpoenaed and deposed Mr. Connell the day before Election Day, and they won the hearing, even with Rove's lawyers constantly objecting. Enough information was revealed that they won, and as a result, the man-in-the-middle structure in Ohio couldn't be used, and there were other states, Iowa, Nevada, and New Mexico also had them, all swing states. So 35 electoral votes at least were saved from corruption, which is a weighty portion to fall on Obama's side, not the total, but very significant. And the thing is that a Republican has never won the presidential election without winning Ohio, and our Ohio heroes saved Ohio for Obama. And Obama won, and he won by a substantial majority, and I lived happily ever after for the next hour, and I was ecstatically happy and relieved when the results, came in at 11, sweeping Obama over the finish line. That's my story, basically, and thank you for listening.